So using the browser is the same thing as making a GET request. Now the cool thing about this is that if the browser gets back an image, it will display it as an actual image instead of raw data that we saw in the console. So here, if we change the URL path to /images/apple.jpg and press enter, it will get back the same image as before, except the browser will display it as an actual image on the page. Same thing happens when the backend responds with HTML. So at the top, if we change the URL path to /documentation and press enter, if the response from the backend is HTML, the browser will display this HTML as an actual web page instead of raw HTML. So again, using the browser is the same thing as making a GET request. And depending on the type of response, the browser can display the response in a more useful way on the page. And that's it. We learned the basics of how a backend works, how to send requests to a backend, and how to send requests to different URL paths. So now let's go back into our code, and we'll remove this URL path and just do .dev so that we don't keep console logging an image, and then save. And let's save this practice code into Git. We'll open the Git section. In backend practice, we learned how to make requests to the backend, and in checkout.js, we loaded that backend practice file. So let's type a message describing our changes. Add backend practice file and commit. Now that we learned what a backend is and how to communicate with a backend, let's use a backend in our project. So first, we're going to open our code, and we're actually going to open checkout.js, and we're going to comment out this import statement because we're not going to run the practice file anymore. So we'll type / to comment that out and save. Next, supersimplebackend.dev has a URL path called /products. This gives us a list of all the products in the Amazon project. So first, let's open our browser and visit this URL path to see what the response looks like. We'll open this tab to supersimplebackend.dev, and we're going to change the URL path at the end to /products and press enter. And you can see that this URL path gives us a JSON response. So this contains all the details of the products for our project. Now, instead of using a file on our computer to load the products, let's use the backend to load the products. So let's go back into our code. And on the left, we're going to open data/products.js. And we're going to scroll down to the array of products at the end. So now, instead of loading the products from this file, we're going to load the products from the backend. So first, let's comment out all this code. If you need to, you can click this arrow on the left to collapse this array. And we're going to comment this out using /* and at the end, */. And above this, we're going to load the products from the backend. First, let's create a variable to save the products again. So we use let products equal an empty array. And let's export this so we can use it outside of this file like before. At the front, we'll type export. Next, let's create a function to load these products from the backend. We'll create a function, and let's name it load products. brackets and curly brackets. And inside here, we're going to create an XML HTTP request again to make a request to my backend. So to create a request, we're going to use new and the class XML HTTP request and brackets. So this will generate a new request object. And let's save this in a variable. So at the front, we'll use const and we'll name it xhr equals this object. Next, we're going to set up the request using xhr.open and brackets. So open takes two parameters. The first parameter is the type of request that we want to send. In this case, the type of request will be the string get. And we're going to give open a second parameter, which is the URL that we want to send this request to. So we'll give it a string, and the URL of my backend is https://super simple backend.dev. And then we'll add the URL path, which is /products. Finally, we're going to send this request using the code xhr.send and brackets. So this will create and set up a request and then send it to my backend. Now remember that .send is asynchronous. That means it will just send the request, but it will not wait for a response to come back. In order to wait for a response, above this code, we're going to create some new lines and set up an event listener using xhr.add event listener and brackets. And this takes two parameters. The first one is the event we want to listen for. In this case, it's the string load, which means the response has loaded. Next, we're going to give it a second parameter, which is a function. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And this is a function that we want to run after the response has loaded. So inside here, after the response has loaded, we can access it using xhr.response. For now, let's console.log this to see what it looks like. So we'll console.log and brackets. Finally, let's run this function so that we run all this code. At the bottom, we're going to load products and brackets and save. So this will send a request to my backend, and then once we get the response, it will display it in the console. So now let's go to our website. We're going to open the project tab. And don't worry if the page is blank for you. We're going to fix this in a bit. For now, we're going to open the console by right-clicking, inspect, and open the console. And in here, you'll see that xhr.response gave us this JSON. And this represents all the products in our Amazon project. Now that we have all this JSON, we're going to convert this back into a JavaScript object and then use it in the rest of our code. Let's go back to our code. And here, the response is a JSON. We're going to convert it back into a JavaScript object, or in this case, a JavaScript array, using the code json.parse and brackets. So once we've converted this back to an array, we're going to replace the products up here with what we loaded from the backend. To do that, we'll do products and make it equal to this result that we got from the backend. Now, one more thing we need to do is previously we converted the product objects into a class. So we're just going to do that again with this array. So we'll select the code from .map all the way to the end, and then right click, copy, and here, after this products array that we got from the backend, right click, paste. We're also going to transform this array from objects into these classes. And at the end, let's console.log this products array to see what it looks like now. So we'll console.log products and save. And now if we open the console for our project, you'll see that products is now an array of product classes and clothing classes. So we converted the response from a JSON into a JavaScript array and then into these classes. So that's how we load data from the backend and then convert it into a JavaScript object or array that we can use in our code. Next, let's go back to our code, and instead of console.logging the products every time, which will display a lot of stuff in the console, let's just console.log a message to make sure that this is working. So we'll change this to the string load products. And now that we have this function, let's use it in each of our pages. First, we're going to remove calling this function for now. And we're going to export this function so we can use it outside of this file. So export and save this file. And we're going to start from the home page. So we'll scroll down to the bottom to amazon.js. And we're going to scroll to the top. And first, we're going to import load products. We're already importing from products.js, so we'll just add a comma and load products. And now before we run all of this code, at the top, we're going to load the products first and brackets. So now let's save and open the project in our browser. And we'll click the top left icon to go to the home page. And you'll see that the home page is actually empty. So what went wrong here? Remember that HTTP requests are asynchronous. If we go back into our code, load products will send a request to my backend, but it takes time for the request to travel across the internet to my backend and to travel back. So here, it will just send the request, and at the next line, the response has not loaded yet. So the products array is still empty. And when we run this code with an empty array, the page will be empty. To solve this problem, we need to wait for this HTTP request to finish first and for the response to come back. And then we're going to run the rest of this code. So how do we do that? So we're going to go to the left and we're going to scroll up to data/products.js. And I'm going to drag this file to the top so we can see the code side by side. And I'll scroll down to the HTTP request, which is right here. And remember that we used an event listener to wait for the response to come back. Once the response is loaded, we're going to run this function. So basically, we want to run all of this code at the bottom of this event listener. So after we've loaded our products. So one way to solve this problem is maybe we can just copy all this code and then paste it at the bottom here. Now, obviously, this doesn't make sense because we're copy pasting a bunch of code and then we can't really reuse this function. A better solution is we're going to put all this code in a function. And then we can give this function to load products. Let's do this step by step. So first, at the top, let's create a function to group all of this code together. We'll use the word function, and let's name it render products grid, brackets and curly brackets. And now we're going to move all of this code into the function. So we can do that by removing this closing curly bracket. And then at the bottom, we're going to scroll down all the way to the bottom. Here, we're going to add back the closing curly bracket to put all this code inside the function. And now let's also select this code so we can fix the indents. So we'll select it all the way up to here, and then press Tab to add an indent. So now we put all the code inside render products grid. Next, we're going to put this function inside load products using a parameter. So between these brackets, we're going to give it this function, render products grid. So remember, in JavaScript, functions are values, and we can use a function as a parameter. So now inside load products, if we go up here, at the top, this function will be saved in a parameter. So let's create a parameter at the top, and we'll name it fun to say that this parameter will contain a function. So we basically saved this function inside this parameter. And now after we load the response, we're going to run the function. So at the bottom here, after we've created the products array, we're going to run fun and brackets. So that's how we run all of this code after we've loaded the products. We group this code into a function, and then we save the function up here. After we load the response, we're going to run the function. So let's save these two files. We'll save products.js, and then down here, we'll save amazon.js. And then open our website, and you'll see that the products loaded again, because this time we're waiting for the response to come back, and then we run our code. So that's how we wait for an HTTP request to finish first, and then we run some code. By the way, this function that we provide to load products, this is known as a callback because we're giving it a function to run in the future or to call in the future. So this function will be called back in the future. And we've actually used callbacks before. When we wrote the code setTimeout, we provided setTimeout a function to run in the future or to call in the future. So this function is also known as a callback. Don't worry if this technique is a little complicated at first. The more you work with callbacks, the more you'll get used to it. Let's get some more practice and use the backend and callbacks on the checkout page. So we're going to open checkout.js, which is the checkout page. And first, we're going to import load products. So at the top, we'll create an import curly brackets load products from a string, and we'll locate products.js. So inside here, we're in the scripts folder. We're going to get out of it using .. And then we're going to go into the data folder. And then we'll add /data/ and we'll load products.js. And then down here, we're also going to load products and brackets. And again, we're going to give load products a callback or a function that we want to run in the future. This time, instead of creating a whole new function, we're just going to create a function inside these brackets using brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So we don't need to create a function name every time. We can also just create an anonymous function or a function without a name, and then give this to load products to run in the future. Now, inside this anonymous function, we're just going to move this code into here. So we'll select this code and then right-click, cut, and then inside here, we're going to right-click and paste. And if you need to, you can fix the formatting. So again, this is going to save this function inside the parameter fun. And then we're going to call fun after we've loaded all the products. So let's save this file and open our website. And we'll click the cart in the top right to go to the checkout page. And now the checkout page is loading again. So that's how we use a backend in our project. We need to send a request and then use a callback to wait for a response and then run the rest of our code. So now let's save our changes into Git. We'll go to the Git section, and in products.js, we created the load products function. In amazon.js, we used load products and gave it a callback. And in checkout.js, we also used load products and we gave it a callback using an anonymous function or a function without a name. Let's create a message describing our changes. Load products from the backend and commit. Next, we're going to learn testing with a backend. Now that we're using a backend in our code, we need to update our tests. First, let's go to our code and we're going to run our tests. So we'll scroll to the bottom, and if you don't have the tests open, we can run them by right-clicking test.html and then click Open with Live Server. Now, I already have the test open in my browser, so I'm just going to open that tab. And for the video, I'll zoom in using Control equals or Command equals. And we have some failing tests now. So if you did the exercises from the previous few lessons, you might have more than 2 failing tests, but we're going to focus on fixing these 2 tests here for the video. So first, let's open the code for our order summary tests. We'll open VS Code, and then on the left, we're going to go into the test folder /checkout/order summary test.js. So now we're going to scroll down in this test and notice that here we are rendering the order summary, which creates the cart on the checkout page. However, this cart requires the products to be loaded from the backend. And currently we're not loading the products in our tests. So that's why the tests are failing. We need to load the products first. To do that, let's import the load products function at the top. So we'll scroll up and we're going to add another import, curly brackets, the load products function from a string, and we'll locate products.js. So we need to get out of checkout and out of tests using .. and then we'll go into the data folder, data/ and load products.js. And now we could call load products inside before each, but this will load the products before each of our tests. So it will load it multiple times. And we don't really need to do this. We only need to load the products once for all of our tests. To do that, we're going to use another hook provided by Jasmine called before all. So above before each, we're going to use the function before all and brackets. So this is the before all hook. It will run a function before all of our tests. Inside these brackets, we're going to give it a function to run. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now, before all of our tests, we're going to load the products. So let's load products and brackets and save. And now let's open our tests in the browser. And unfortunately, the tests are still failing. Let's go back to our code and see what the problem is. We'll open VS Code. And here, remember that load products is asynchronous. That means it just sends a request to my backend, but it doesn't wait for the response to come back. So it would just send a request and then continue with the rest of the test code. And unfortunately, at this point, the response has not come back yet. Products is still an empty array. To fix this issue, we need to wait for load products to finish first, and then continue with the rest of the test. To do that, Jasmine has a feature for waiting for some code to finish called a done function. So in before all, we can give this inner function one parameter called done. So done is a function, and it's provided by Jasmine. When we add this done parameter, before all will not automatically go to the next step. Now it's just going to wait, and it will only go to the next step when we call this done function. So when we do done and brackets, then it will go to the next step. If we don't call done, then before all, we'll just keep waiting forever. So this done function allows us to control exactly when before all finishes and goes to the next step. And this is what we need to fix the test. We need to wait for load products to finish first, and then we're going to call done and then go to the next step. To wait for load products to finish, remember, we're going to give it a function. So between these brackets, we'll create a function using brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. Now, once the products have finished loading, it will run the function. Inside here, we're going to call done and brackets. So this makes sure that the products load first, and then we call done, and then it goes to the next step, which is the before each hook, and then eventually it runs the tests at the bottom. So now let's save and take a look at our test page, and you'll see that those order summary tests are now passing. If you have any other failed tests, I'll leave that as an exercise. Let's go back to our code. And that's how we test with a backend. We wait until the backend code is finished, and then we use the done function to control exactly when to go to the next step. By the way, we can also use done inside before each and inside it as well to wait for backend code to finish. Now let's save our changes into Git. We'll open the Git section, and inside order summary test, we imported load products, and then we called load products and used the done function to make sure that the products are loaded first, and then we go to the next step. Let's create a message describing our changes. Load products in before all hook and commit. Next, we're going to learn promises, which are a better way to handle asynchronous code. Promises are similar to Jasmine's done function that we just learned. they let us wait for some asynchronous code to finish before going to the next step. So now let's create our first promise. We're going to open our code, and on the left, we're going to go to checkout.js. And in here, at the top, we're going to practice promises. Promise is a class. So we're going to type the code new, capital P, promise, and brackets to create a new promise object. Now inside these brackets, we're going to give it a function. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So that's just how promises are designed. It's a built-in class, and when we create a promise, we need to give it a function. So when we create this promise, it's going to run this function immediately. So inside here, let's console.log the string promise to show that it runs immediately. So we'll save this file and then go to the website, and we'll open the tab for our project. And I'm going to zoom out a bit by pressing Control or Command minus, and then open the console. Right-click, inspect, and the console. And you'll see it logged promise. So when we create a promise, it runs this inner function immediately. Now this inner function gets a parameter called resolve. And resolve is a function, and it works very similar to Jasmine's done function. So resolve lets us control when to go to the next step. For example, let's add some asynchronous code into this promise. We'll remove the console.log, and we're going to run load products, which is asynchronous. So here we'll type load products and brackets. And now we're going to give load products a callback function, like we did down here. Brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So it will run this function after load products is finished. Once this is finished, we want to go to the next step. So here, we're going to call resolve. So resolve and brackets. So you can see that the syntax here is very similar to Jasmine's done function. We run some asynchronous code, and then we wait for it to finish, and then we call resolve to go to the next step. Now, what is the next step to this promise? So you might think that this code down here is the next step. However, a promise actually creates a separate line of code or a separate thread of code. So here, these two groups of code are sort of running at the same time. Feel free to pause the video to get a longer look at this diagram. The reason promises are designed this way is it allows JavaScript to do multiple things at the same time. So when the promise finishes, it can do a next step. But this next step is going to be separate from the rest of the code. It sort of does the next step on the side. So right now, this promise creates a separate thread of code. But this separate thread doesn't actually have a next step. So we're going to add one. To add a next step to a promise, at the end, we're going to use a method called .then and brackets. And we need to give .then a function. So we're going to type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And inside here, let's just console.log the string next step. So first, we run this asynchronous code, and then we wait for it to finish, and then we run resolve. and resolve makes it go to the next step. To make this easier to see in the console, let's actually add some console.logs to track the progress of this code. So at the top, let's console.log the string start promise. And then in here, let's console.log the string finished loading. And we'll also comment out the code that we had before. So we'll type /* and at the bottom, //. And now let's save and check our console. So let's go through this step by step. First, we start the promise, which we see here, and then we call load products, which we see here. Once the products are finished loading, it's going to run this function, and then we'll display finish loading. And then we're going to call resolve, which goes to the next step, which runs this function. And we display next step. So resolve lets us control when to go to the next step. In this case, we waited until load products was finished, and then we called resolve to go to the next step. So that's how promises work. They let us split our code into separate steps, and then we can wait for one step to finish before going to the next step. Now that we understand promises, let's convert the code that we had before from a callback to using a promise. So first, let's remove these console.logs to make our code a little easier to read. Now, in our previous code, we actually had two steps. The first step is to call load products. And then once this is finished, the second step is to call render order summary and render payment summary. And in our promise, we have the same thing. Our first step is load products. Once this is finished, we're going to call resolve and then go to the second step. So we're just going to copy this second step into the second step up here. So we'll select this code and then right click, copy, and in .then we're going to right click and paste. And now let's save and let's check the web page. So we'll open the project and you can see that everything is loading correctly. So this promise does the same thing as a callback that we had before. Both of them have two steps. The first step is to load the products, and then we wait for the products to finish loading, and then we do the second step, which is to render the page. So now you might be wondering, why do we use promises? It looks like it's more work and more code than just using a callback. So callbacks have a big problem, which is multiple callbacks cause a lot of nesting. Nesting means having code inside code, like this. To see why this is a problem, let's say that we want to load the cart from the backend as well. I actually set up a URL path that we can use to practice, called /cart. So first, let's go into products.js, and we're going to copy load products and change it to load the cart. So we'll select this function, and then right-click, copy, and let's open cart.js, since we're going to load the cart from the backend. And let's scroll down to the bottom. And here, we'll right-click and paste that code. And now, instead of loading the products, let's load the cart from the backend. So first, let's rename this function to load C cart. And the first thing we need to change is the URL path. So instead of loading slash products, we're going to load slash cart from my backend. So normally when we load slash cart, the backend will give us a cart array. However, since we're just practicing, my backend will just give us some text when we load slash cart. Next, we don't need this products code anymore. So we can select it and then delete it. And instead, let's just console.log brackets, and we'll just display the response that we get back. xhr.response. And we can remove this other console.log and save. So now let's use load cart in our previous example. On the left, we'll scroll down and open checkout.js. And at the top, let's import load cart. So here we'll import curly brackets, load cart from a string, and we'll go to the data folder, which is /data/, and we'll load cart.js. And now we're going to use this in our callback code to show the problem with callbacks. First, let's comment out this promise so we can focus on the callback code. At the top, we'll type /star, and here //, and we'll remove the comments for the callback. And after we load the products, we're also going to load the cart. So inside this function, we're going to type load cart brackets, and we're going to give it a function. So this function is going to run after the cart has loaded. So now let's say that we want to wait for the products and the cart to load before we render the page. To do that, we need to move this code inside this inner function. So we'll select this and then right-click, cut. Inside load cart, we're going to right-click and paste. And remove this extra line. So now this code is going to load the products, wait for it to finish, and then it's going to load the cart, and then wait for the cart to finish, and then it will render the page or display the page. So let's save and check the console. And now you can see that we loaded the products, and then we loaded the cart. And if we open the page, everything was displayed properly. So now let's go back to our code and notice that when we added another callback, we created another layer of nesting. So we have code inside code inside code. The problem with this is that each layer of nesting adds some indents at the front or spaces at the front. This means if we have lots of callbacks, our code will become more and more nested, like this. This is a big problem with callbacks. Multiple callbacks cause a lot of nesting, and all these indents make our code hard to work with. Promises solve this problem by letting us flatten our code. For example, let's load the products and the carts again, but this time using our promise instead. First, let's comment out the callback using /star, and at the bottom, //, and we're going to uncomment the promise. So here, we'll remove the comments. And then in the next step, instead of rendering the page, we're going to load the cart like we did down here. So we'll type load cart and brackets. Now we have a problem here. We want to wait for load cart to finish, and then go to the next step. However, we usually do this using resolve, but we don't have resolve inside this function. To solve this problem, inside .then, we can actually return a new promise. So at the top, we're going to return a new promise and brackets. So we're going to give this promise a function, just like we did up here. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And this function gets one parameter called resolve. So inside .then, if we want to use resolve to wait for some code to finish, we can return a new promise. So now let's move our code into this new promise so we can use resolve. So we'll select this code and then right click, cut, and inside here, we're going to right click and paste and remove these new lines. And we can give loadCart a function to run when it's finished. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. Once loadCart is finished, it runs this function, and then inside here, we're going to call resolve so that we move to the next step. So here, we'll call resolve and brackets. So now this will go to the next step. And we currently don't have a next step to this promise. So let's add the next step. At the end, to add another step, we're going to use .then, brackets. And we'll give this a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So the third step is to render the page. So we're going to do the same thing inside here. So let's select this code and we'll right click, copy. Inside the third step, we're going to right click and paste. And adjust the formatting if you need to. So that's how we do these 3 steps in the callback using a promise. We do the first step, wait for it to finish, call resolve, and then it goes to the second step. We do the second step, wait for it to finish, call resolve, and then we go to the third step. So a promise lets us have as many steps as we want, and we can use resolve to wait for each step to finish before going to the next step. So let's save this and check the console to make sure it worked. So we'll open the console, and inside here, we have the same messages as last time. First, we load the products, we wait for it to finish, and then go to the next step. Then we load the cart, wait for it to finish, and then go to the next step. And then we render or display the page. If we open the page, you'll see that everything displayed properly. So now let's go back and compare promises and callbacks. So even though promises require a bunch of setup code, you can see that it keeps our code relatively flat. The third step doesn't get more and more nested, like in callbacks. So if we have lots of steps in our promise, this is what the code will look like. You can see that even when we add more steps, the code does not become more and more nested. So promises help keep our code flat and avoid too much nesting. So that's why it's recommended to use promises instead of callbacks. Promises will keep our code more flat. So let's actually add some new lines here, as well as here, to better separate these steps, so it's a little easier to read. Lastly, we're going to learn 2 more features of promises. The first feature is we can give resolve a value. So inside here, let's give it a value like the string value1. So whatever we give to resolve is going to be saved in a parameter inside .then. So inside this function, we can add a parameter called value. And now whatever we give to resolve is going to be saved inside here. And now we can use it. So this lets us share a value between two steps of a promise. So in here, let's check if this worked using console.log value and save. And if we look inside our console, you'll see that it displayed value1. So whatever we give to resolve will be saved in this parameter. The second feature is we can run multiple promises at the same time. Currently, we wait for things to load one at a time. For example, we wait for the products to load, and then we wait for the cart to load, and then we go to the next step. To make this more efficient, we can actually load the products and the cart at the same time. To do that, we can use a feature called promise.all. Promise.all lets us run multiple promises at the same time and wait for all of them to finish. So let's scroll to the top and we'll do an example. So here, we'll type the code capital P promise dot all and brackets. Inside these brackets, we're going to give this an array. Inside this array, we can give it multiple promises to wait for. So let's just copy paste the two promises that we have here into this array. So we'll start from here at the end of the first promise, and we'll select this code, right click, copy, and in this array, we're going to right click and paste. And remove this line. So we have our first promise, and at the end, we're going to add a comma, and we're going to give it a second promise. So we'll scroll down to our second promise here, and we're going to select this code, starting from here, and select the promise, right click, copy, and at the top, we're going to right click and paste. So we basically created an array of promises, and then we're going to give this array to promise.all, and it's going to wait for all of the promises to finish before going to the next step. So now let's add a next step. At the end, to add a next step, we're going to use .then and brackets, and we'll add a new line to make it a little easier to read. So as usual, .then adds a next step to a promise. And we'll give it a function to run. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. After we load the products and we load the cart, we're going to render the page. So let's copy paste that code inside this next step. So we'll scroll down to the rendered code and we'll select it, right click, copy, and at the top, inside .then, we'll right click and paste. So now let's comment out our old promise and try out promise.all. Above our old promise, we're going to type /*, and below it, we're going to type */. And let's save. We'll go to our console, and you can see that it did the same thing. It loaded the products, and it loaded the cart, and it's going to wait for both of them to call resolve before going to the next step, which is to render or display the page. If we open the page, you'll see that everything displayed properly. So that's promise.all. We can give it an array of promises, and it will run both of them at the same time, instead of waiting for each promise one by one. Also, the values that we give to resolve are saved in a parameter. So inside .then, we can add a parameter called values, and then these values that we give to resolve are going to be saved inside here. So if we console.log values and save and check the console, and it gives us an array of values. The first value is from the first promise, and the second value is from the second promise. So here we didn't give anything to resolve, so the second value is undefined. So that's an overview of promises and promise.all. Promises are a better way to wait for asynchronous code to finish versus callbacks, because they help us avoid nesting and keep our code relatively flat. Promises also have more features, like promise.all, which lets us run multiple promises at the same time. Now let's save our changes into Git. We're going to open the Git section. Inside cart.js, we added a function to practice loading the cart from the backend. And then in checkout.js, we learned promises and converted our code from a callback to a promise. Let's type a message describing our changes. Learn promises and convert code to promises and commit. Now that we learned promises, we're going to learn another feature called fetch. Fetch is a better way to make HTTP requests. Let's go back to our code, and we're going to open products.js. And we're going to scroll down to the load products function. Currently, we're using XML HTTP request to make requests to the backend, and this uses a callback. Fetch also lets us make requests to the backend, but fetch uses a promise. So let's do an example, and we'll make the same request except using fetch this time. We'll scroll up, and above load products, let's create another function using function, and we'll name it load products fetch and brackets and curly brackets. And to use fetch, we're going to use the built-in function fetch and brackets. So this makes an HTTP request, just like we did down here. So let's make the same request as we did in this function. At the bottom, we made a GET request to this URL. So by default, fetch will make a GET request. So we just need to give it the URL that we want to make the request to. So at the bottom, let's select this URL, and we're just going to right-click, copy, and at the top, inside fetch, we're going to right-click and paste. So this will make the exact same request as we did below. So you can see that fetch is a lot more simple than XML HTTP request. We don't have to create a new object or do any setup. We can just call fetch and tell it where we want the request to go. So this will send a request to the backend. And now, how do we get the response? So instead of using a callback to get the response, fetch uses a promise. When we call fetch, this is going to create a promise. And we can add a next step to this promise using dot then and brackets. So we'll give dot then a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So the way this works is that fetch is going to send a request to the backend. When we get a response, it's going to go to the next step. It's also going to save the response inside a parameter in here. So we'll add a parameter called response. And this will contain the response from the backend. So instead of using a callback to wait for the response, fetch uses a promise to wait for the response. So here, let's console.log the response to see what it looks like. And now let's run this code. At the bottom, we'll run this function using load products fetch and brackets. So now let's save and take a look at the console. So here's the response that we get from fetch. If we open it, you can see it gives us a bunch of information about the response, like the status or whether it succeeded or failed, as well as the URL that we made the request to. So how do we get the data for the products from this response? To do that, we'll go back to our code. And to get data that's attached to this response, we're going to use response.json and brackets. So this gives us the JSON or the data attached to the response. In this case, it's our products data. Next, response.json is actually asynchronous. It returns a promise. So we need to wait for this promise to finish before we continue to the next step. To do that, inside .then, we can actually return another promise. So here, we're going to return this promise. When we return a promise, it will wait for this promise to finish before going to the next step. So now let's add another step to this promise using .then brackets, and we'll give this a function again. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. When response.json finishes, it's going to give us the data that's attached to the response, and it's going to save it inside this parameter. So this response should contain our products data. So let's name this parameter products data. And let's console.log this to see what it looks like. So here, we'll console.log the products data and save. And let's open the console. And you see here that the products data is the array of products that we're going to use in our Amazon project. You'll also notice that instead of giving us just a big JSON string like before, it actually converted the JSON into an array. So basically, it did json.parse on the response for us. So this saved us a little bit of code. Finally, now that we have the products array, let's do the same thing that we did down here. So we'll scroll down and select all of this code, and we'll right-click, copy, and then up here, we'll remove this, and right-click, and paste. So we'll do the same steps as before, except using a promise this time. First, instead of doing json.parse on the response, we already have the array of products. So we can remove this and replace it with products data. And then we're still going to convert this from objects to classes like before. We'll keep this console.log so we can track the progress. This last line of code let us do something after we finished loading the products. However, instead of using a callback like before, we're going to remove this line. And to do something after this step, we can actually return this entire promise. So to make it easier to read, let's save this entire promise into a variable using const. Let's call it promise equals fetch. So let's add some new lines here as well as here to make the code a little easier to read. So we're basically calling fetch, which creates a promise, and then we're going to save this promise inside this variable. And then at the end of this function, we can just return the promise. So we're just going to return this whole promise out of the function. And then we can add even more steps after this promise. So down here, this is going to give us the promise. And then we can attach another step using dot then brackets. And inside here, we can give it a function. Brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So this attaches another step to the end of this promise. So basically attaches another step here. So after we load all the products, let's just console.log next step and save. So we'll check the console and we'll see that we loaded the products. And then after we did the next step. So we can actually return a promise out of a function and then keep attaching more steps to that promise. So that's how we use fetch. It's a better way to make HTTP requests because it uses promises directly. So now let's use fetch in our project instead of using XML HTTP request. So first, let's comment out this code because we were just practicing. We'll type /* and at the bottom, */. And let's scroll up to load products fetch. And we're going to export this function so we can use it outside this file. Let's save. We'll go to the left and open checkout.js. And here, instead of using load products, which uses callbacks, let's switch to load products fetch, which uses promises. We'll scroll up and we're going to import load products fetch. So here we're already importing from products.js. We'll type a comma, load products fetch. And now we'll replace load products. So remember that we need to give this a promise. And also remember that fetch returns a promise. So all we need to do is to remove this code and just call load products fetch and brackets. This will return a promise and we can use it with promise.all. So now let's save. We'll check our website and you'll see that everything is still working. So fetch helps us make our code a lot cleaner because it can return a promise directly and we don't have to type out all of this extra code. Finally, let's use fetch inside our tests. On the left, we'll open order-summary-test.js. And remember that inside here, we used load products. So let's switch this to using load products fetch instead. First, we'll import it. At the top, we're importing from products.js. So we'll type comma and import load products fetch. And instead of load products, we're going to call load products fetch and brackets. So remember that this returns a promise and we can attach more steps to this promise using the method .then and brackets. And we'll give .then a function to run. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. Once the products are finished loading, it's going to run .then, and inside here, we're going to call done to go to the next step of the test. So here, we'll just call done and brackets, and we'll remove the old code. So now let's save to make sure this is working, and we'll open the tests, go to the browser, and open the test, and the order summary tests should be passing. So now let's save our changes into Git. We'll open the Git section. Inside products.js, we learned how to use fetch, which returns a promise directly. Inside checkout.js, we used load products fetch inside our project. And in order summary test.js, we used load products fetch inside our tests. Let's create a message describing these changes. Convert load products from XHR or XML HTTP request to fetch and commit. Next, we're going to learn async await, which is an even better way to handle asynchronous code. Let's go back to our code and we'll open checkout.js. Currently, we're using promises to handle asynchronous code. But the problem with promises is that it creates a lot of extra code. For example, we need to create a new promise, we need to use resolve, and we need to use .then. Async await is a shortcut for promises, and it removes all this extra code. So let's do our first example of async await. We're going to scroll up, and at the top, we're going to create a function using function, and let's name it load page, brackets and curly brackets. And inside, we're going to console.log the string load page. And now we'll learn the first part of async await, which is async. In front of the word function, we're going to add the word async and space. So async makes a function return a promise. So this code is a shortcut for this code. It basically wraps the code in a promise. So now let's run this function to show that it actually returns a promise. So below this, we'll call load page and brackets. And because this returns a promise, we can add a next step to this promise using .then brackets. And we'll give .then a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And inside here, let's just console.log the string next step. Now let's save and we'll check the console. So we'll open the console and you'll see that we loaded the page, and then in the next step, we displayed next step. So when we put async in front of function, it makes this function return a promise. This code is a shortcut for this code. Next, if we return something from this function, for example, we're going to return a value like the string value2. This gets converted into resolve value2. So this value is going to be saved in a parameter in the next step. So here, we'll add a parameter value, and value2 is going to be saved inside here. If we console.log the value and save, and then check the console. We'll see that value is equal to this string. And that's it for async. It just makes a function return a promise. Now you might be wondering, what's the point of this feature? So the reason we use async is because it lets us use the second feature called await. Await lets us wait for a promise to finish before going to the next line. So let's do an example. Inside here, let's run some code that creates a promise. Let's run load products fetch. So we'll type load products fetch and brackets. So this loads the products from the backend. And usually this returns a promise. So one way to wait for this to finish is to use .then and then give it a function. So this runs this function after load products has finished. Now await gives us another way to wait for this promise to finish. Instead of using .then, at the front, we can just type await. So await lets us write asynchronous code like normal code. So now it will wait for this line to finish and get the response from the backend before going to the next line. So we don't have to do any more .then. We just write it like normal code, line by line. This code is a shortcut for this code. And this makes our code a lot easier to read than what we have down here. So now let's see what this looks like in the console. Before we save, let's comment out this promise at the bottom so we don't get confused. So we'll type /* and at the bottom */. And now we're going to save this code and check the console to see what it did. So you see that we loaded the page, and then notice that it finished loading the products before going to the next step. So this actually waits for this line to finish before going to the next line in the code. And this makes our code a lot cleaner. Now, one very important thing to know is that we can only use await when we're inside an async function. That's actually the main reason we use async, so that we can use await to make our code cleaner. Now that we learned async await, let's use it in our project. So previously, we loaded the products, and then we loaded the cart, and then we rendered the page. So let's recreate this using async await. First, we want to load the products, which we did here, and we're going to wait for this to finish. And then we're going to load the cart. So to load the cart, let's use this promise down here. Async await can only be used with promises. It doesn't do anything with a callback. So we'll select this promise and right-click, copy, and then up here, we're going to load the cart with a promise by right-clicking and paste. So now we want to wait for this promise to finish before going to the next line. To do that, at the front, we can simply type await. Finally, after we load the products and we load the cart, we're going to render the page. So we'll scroll down and we'll select this code. And we're going to right-click, copy, and at the top, we're going to right-click and paste. And that's it. You can see that our asynchronous code is a lot cleaner now. We load the products, and then we just wait for it to finish. Then we load the cart, and we also wait for it to finish. And then we run the rest of our code. So we can write asynchronous code like normal code. So now let's remove the console.log at the top and also remove this return value because we don't need it. And we'll remove .then at the end. And let's save. So now if we open our website and open the project, you can see that everything loaded properly. Inside the console, you can see that we loaded the products first, wait for it to finish, then load the cart, wait for it to finish, and then we displayed the page. So that's how we use async await to make our code a lot cleaner than what we had before. So now we'll learn some more details about async await. As I mentioned, we can only use await inside an async function. Also, the closest function has to be async. For example, here we have an async function at the top, and inside we have a normal function. So we can't use await inside the normal function. We have to make this one async. Another detail is if a promise resolves with a value, for example, here, we give resolve a value like the string value 3. Normally, this value will be saved in the next step. So if we did .then and gave it a function, this value would be saved in this parameter. However, if we use await, this value just gets returned and we can save it in a variable. So instead of using .then, we can simply save whatever is resolved inside a variable using const value equals. And this makes our code a lot easier to read. Instead of having to use .then, we can simply save this inside a variable, like normal code. And finally, we can use await with promise.all as well, but I'll leave that as an exercise. So that's async await. It's a shortcut for promises, and it lets us write asynchronous code like normal code. So when working with asynchronous code, a best practice is to use async await over promises and callbacks because they are much cleaner. So now let's save our changes into Git. We'll open the Git section. In checkout.js, we created the load page function where we learned async and await. Let's create a message describing these changes. Convert from promises to async await and commit. Now we're going to learn about error handling. When we're sending HTTP requests across the internet, we could get unexpected errors. For example, the internet connection might stop working. So we're going to learn how to handle these kinds of unexpected errors. Let's go back to our code, and we're going to open data/products.js. And we're going to scroll to the load products function. So this uses a callback to send a request and get a response. Now, what if there's an error along the way? For callbacks, we usually set up a separate callback just for errors. For example, below this, we're going to add another event listener using xhr dot add event listener brackets, and the first parameter is the event. This time we're going to listen for the error event, and then we're going to give it a function. So now if we get an unexpected error, it's going to run this function. So if we get an error, let's just console log a message. Console.log a string unexpected error. And usually when we get an error, we give some instructions on what to do. Here, let's just type, please try again later, and save. So this is called error handling. If we get an error during the request, we can handle it with this function. So we just display a message. So now let's try out this code. To simulate an error, we're going to change the URL of the request to error.supersimplebackend.dev. So this will create an error because this URL doesn't exist. So now down here, let's call this function so that we run this code and get the error. So we'll type load products and brackets and save. Let's check the console. And you'll see that we displayed this error message. So we got an error and it ran this error function, and it did not run the load function above. Also, usually this callback gets a parameter called error, and this contains some information about the error. So that's how we handle errors when using callbacks. We usually set up a separate callback just for errors. So now let's remove this line since it was just for practice, and we'll remove error from the URL and change it back to supersimplebackend.dev and save. Next, we'll learn how to handle errors in promises. So we'll scroll up to the load products fetch function, and this makes the same request as below, but it uses promises. To handle an error in promises, promises give us two methods, .then and another method called .catch, brackets, and we're going to give .catch a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So now, if this request has an error, it's going to go to this catch method, and it's going to run this error function. So inside here, let's also display a message. So let's just copy the message that we had below. We're going to select this message, and then right-click, copy, and then inside catch, we're going to right-click and paste. And again, to simulate an error, we're going to scroll up and change the URL. So we're going to add error at the front, .supersimplebackend.dev. So now let's call this function and test out this error code. At the bottom, we'll type load products fetch and brackets and save. So now let's open the console, and you'll see in here that we displayed the error message. So we're successfully creating an error. It's going inside catch, and it displays this message. So just like callbacks, .catch gets a parameter called error. And this contains information about the error if we need it. So that's how we handle errors with promises. We have another method called .catch that will run this function if there's an error. So now let's remove this practice code and switch back the URL. So remove error and dot and save. Lastly, we'll learn how to handle errors in async await. So let's go to the left and we're going to open the checkout file. So we'll scroll down and open checkout.js. And inside here, we're using async await. So to catch errors when using async await, we're going to use some new syntax called try catch. Above this, we're going to type the word try and curly brackets. And now we're going to put the code that could cause an error into try. So here, we're making a request to the backend, and here we're also making a request to the backend. So this code could cause an error. So we're going to move it inside try. So we'll select it, right click, cut, and then inside here, we'll right click and paste. And now, if any of this code inside a try gets an error, we can catch it using this code. At the bottom, we'll type catch, brackets and curly brackets. Now catch is going to get one parameter in these brackets called error. And this contains information about the error if we need it. So catch works similarly to .catch for promises. If there's an error inside here, it's going to catch the error, or it's going to handle the error and run the code inside catch. So in here, we can put our error message. So let's go back to products.js and let's copy the error message. So we'll select this and right click, copy, and back to checkout. Inside catch, we'll right click and paste. So now I'll remove this new line and add a new line here to make it a little easier to read. And let's test out this code. To do that, we'll go inside products.js again, and we're going to modify the URL again. So at the front here, we're going to add error dot super simple backend. And also, we're going to comment out the dot catch, because right now the error is going to be handled here, and it's not going to be handled outside in the try catch. So we're going to comment this out using /* and at the end */ and save. So we'll go back to checkout.js, and here we'll also save. And now let's open the console, and you'll see that we had an error here. We caught the error and it ran this code and displayed the error message. So that's how we handle errors with async await. We put our code that can cause an error inside try, and if there is an error, it's going to run the code inside catch. So now let's go back to products and remove error from the URL and the dot, and we'll also uncomment .catch and save. Next, we're going to learn some more details about try catch. So we'll open checkout.js, and one thing to know about try catch is that we don't have to use it with async await. We can actually use try catch with synchronous code or normal code. For example, here we try to run a function that does not exist, and this will cause an error. Try catch will catch this error and display a message. So notice that we're not using async await here. This is just normal code. So we can use try catch to catch errors in normal code as well. Another detail is whenever we get an error, it will skip the rest of the code. So here, it will not console.log next line. It will skip the rest of this code and go directly into catch. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, why don't we just use try catch everywhere and prevent all of our errors? So try catch and any error handling is meant to handle unexpected errors. That means our code is correct, but something outside our control caused the error. So we can give some instructions on what to do. So that's why we don't use try catch everywhere. We only use it for unexpected errors or errors outside of our control. So the last thing to know about error handling is that we can manually create errors. To manually create an error in try catch, at the top, we're going to use the word throw. So throw creates a new error, or it throws an error that we're going to catch later. And now we need to give this error a value. So we can use any type of value for an error, like a string, number, or an object. For an example, we're just going to use the string error1. So this will manually create an error. When we get an error, it's going to skip the rest of the code inside these curly brackets. And it's going to go straight into catch. So this error value is going to be saved inside this parameter, and it's going to run the code inside catch. So if we save and then check the console, throw creates an error, and it's going to display this error message up here. So now let's comment out this example and save. Next, if we're using promises, there are two ways to manually create an error. So inside this promise, if we want to manually create an error, we can also just throw an error, like the string error2. And this will throw an error and go inside .catch. By the way, if we await a promise, instead of going into .catch, it's going to go inside catch here. So await makes it behave sort of like synchronous code or normal code. If we save and check the console, it will get an error, it will not load the cart, and it will display this error message. So now let's comment out this example, and we'll learn the second way to create an error in a promise. Inside a promise, if we need to create an error in the future, then we need to use different code. For example, here we load the cart, and then once it's finished loading, we're going to run this function. So this function runs in the future. Inside this function, throw does not work because throw does not work in the future. Instead, promises give us another way to create an error. When we create a new promise, it gives us a second parameter called reject. Reject is a function, and it lets us create an error in the future. So here, after we load the cart, in the future, let's create an error using reject, brackets, and a string error3. So let's comment out resolve as an example. So now let's save and check the console. And you see that reject created an error in the future. And then it goes down here and runs the code inside catch and creates the error message. So to manually create an error in a promise, we have two ways. We can use throw if we're creating the error synchronously or right away, or we can use reject if we're creating the error asynchronously or in the future. So now let's comment out reject and uncomment resolve and save. So that's error handling. It lets us handle unexpected errors, and it also lets us create our own errors. So now let's save these changes into Git. We'll open Git inside products.js. We added .catch for promises and an error function for callbacks. And then in checkout.js, we added try catch for async await. And we also learned how to manually create our own errors. So we'll type a message describing our changes, learn error handling, and commit. Now that we learned backend, promises, and async await, let's use them in our project. We'll open our project and open the tab for the project, and we're going to go to the checkout page. So the feature we're going to work on is in the checkout page, we're going to make this place order button interactive. When we click this button, it's going to take our cart and turn it into an order. This time, instead of writing this code ourselves, we're going to use the backend to create an order. So first, let's set up an event listener for this button. We'll go back to our code and open our files. And that button is in a section called the payment summary. So we're going to open scripts/checkout/payment-summary.js. So now let's find the code for the button. To make it easier, we're going to press Ctrl F or Command F to search for code, and we're going to search for the text in the button. So we'll search for place your order. And now we have the code for the button right here. So we're going to set up an event listener so we can do something when we click it. First, we'll add a class to the button so we can get it in our JavaScript. At the end of the class, let's create a new line and add a class js-place-order. And now after we put this HTML on the page, we're going to set up an event listener. To do that, we're going to get this button into our JavaScript using document.querySelector, brackets, and a string. And to select this class, we're going to start with a .js-place-order. And now that we have this button, we're going to add an event listener to it. So we'll create a new line and use the method .add event listener, brackets. And we'll give this two parameters. The first parameter is the event we want to listen for, which is click. And the second parameter is a function we want to run when we click this button. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now when we click this button, we're going to make a request to the backend to create the order. So for this example, I set up a URL path in my backend for creating orders called /orders. So inside here, we're going to make a request to the backend using fetch, brackets, and then we're going to give it the URL of the request, which is https://super simple backend.dev, and the URL path /orders. However, this time we need to send some data to the backend. So we need to send our cart to the backend in order to create an order. To send data in a request, we need to use a different type of requests. So there are 4 common types of requests: get, post, put and delete. Get means we want to get something from the backend. Post means we want the backend to create something. Put means we want it to update something. And delete means we want to delete something. So far, we only use get requests, which let us get data from the backend. However, get requests don't really let us send data to the backend. So in this situation, we want to create an order. So we're going to use post to create something. Post lets us send data to the backend. So to create a post request instead of a get request, we're going to give fetch a second parameter, which is an object. And inside this object, we're going to give it a property called method, colon, and this is the type of the request. In this case, we'll use the string post. And after this, we're going to give another property called headers, colon, and this is going to be an object. Headers gives the backend more information about our request. And this is needed when we're sending data to the backend. Inside this object, we'll add the property string capital C content dash capital T type, colon, and the value will be the string application slash JSON. This tells the backend what type of data we're sending in our request. Here, we're going to send some JSON, which is basically a JavaScript object. Next, we're going to add another property called body, colon, and this is the actual data we're going to send to the backend. According to the documentation, we need to send an object with a property called cart, and this contains our cart array. So in the body, let's send an object with a property called cart, colon, and give it the cart array. So we should have the cart array in this file, and it should be called cart. And finally, we can't send an object directly in our request. We need to convert it into a JSON string. To do that, at the front, we'll use JSON.stringify, open bracket, and close bracket. So this will convert this data into a JSON string, and now we can send it to the backend. Okay, so after we send this request, we need to wait for the response to come back. To do that, fetch returns a promise. However, instead of using .then to add a next step, let's use async await because it's cleaner. So first we need to make this function async. Remember, we can only use await inside an async function. So at the front of this function, we'll type the word async. And now in front of fetch, we can use await. This is going to wait for fetch to finish or for fetch to get a response from the backend and then go to the next line. Now, because we used await, we can save the response in a variable. So at the front, we'll create a variable, const, and call it response, and make it equal to this result. Next, remember that to get the data that's attached to the response, we need to use response.json. So down here, we're going to use response.json and brackets. Now remember that response.json is also a promise. So at the front, we can use await to wait for this promise to finish before going to the next line. So this will give us the data that's attached to the response, which should be the order that was created by the backend. So let's save this in a variable using const order equals. And finally, let's console.log the order to see what it looks like. So now let's save, and then we'll open the project and make sure you have some products in your cart. And then we'll click place order. And now we can check our console to see what the order looks like. And you'll see that we got an order object from the backend. It has an order ID, an order time, and the products in our order, including a delivery time and the quantity that we want. So we successfully used the backend to create a new order. Let's also check the network tab up here and open network. So I'll resize this to make it a little easier to read. And we'll search for the super simple URL. And then we'll find this request, orders, with a status 200, and we'll click it. So inside the details, you'll see that it was a post request sent to /orders, and the status code was 200, so it was successful. Inside the payload tab, this is what we sent to the backend, which is our cart. In the preview tab, this is what the backend sent back, an order object. And the response tab is the same thing. We got the order object back. So that's how a real-world website works. Instead of creating the order on the web page or on our computer, we send an HTTP request to the backend to create the order. Okay, now that we created an order, let's save it somewhere. We'll go back to our code, and on the left, inside the data folder, let's create a file for our orders. So we'll click inside this folder, and then click here to create a file, and let's name it orders.js, and press enter. At the top, let's create an array to contain all of our orders. We'll use const orders equals an empty array. And let's export this so we can use it in other files. Export. Next, let's create a function for adding an order to this array. So we'll create a function, add order, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll give this function an order object, and we're just going to add it to the array. Now for orders, we usually want the most recent order at the top. So we're going to add this order to the front of the array. To do that, we'll type the array name, orders, and use the method .unshift, brackets, and we'll give it the order. So this will add the order to the front of the array instead of the back. Finally, let's save our orders into local storage. So we'll create a function to save to local storage, function save to storage, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll run local storage dot set item, brackets, and a string. We'll use a local storage key orders, comma, and remember, local storage only supports strings, so we'll use json.stringify, brackets, orders. And now when we modify this array, we're going to save to storage and brackets. Finally, at the top, let's load the orders from storage. So here, we'll use local storage dot get item, brackets, the string orders. And remember that this will be a string, so we need to convert it back into an array using the code json.parse and brackets. Now, in the beginning, we're not going to have any orders saved in local storage. So we can give this a default value using or and an empty array. So if there's nothing in local storage, it's going to use this empty array as a default and save. So now let's use add order in the payment summary. So first, we'll export this function and save, and then open the payment summary again. And at the top, we're going to import that function. So here we'll import curly brackets, add order from a string, and we'll go into the data folder, which is data/orders.js. And we'll scroll back down. And now after we create an order from the backend, we're going to add it to the array and save it in local storage using the function add order brackets the order object and save. Now, if we go to our web page and click place order, this should create an order from the backend and save it in local storage. So now we can open our console and go to the console tab. And let's check if it's inside local storage using local storage dot get item brackets and a string orders, and press enter. And you'll see that we saved an order in local storage. If you ever want to remove the orders from local storage, you can use this code. Local storage dot remove item brackets and the string orders. Press enter and then refresh the page. Let's go back to our code and let's get some practice and add some error handling to this code. So at the top, for async await, we're going to use try catch. So we'll type try curly bracket and catch brackets and curly brackets. And catch gets a parameter called error. So now we're going to move our code inside try. We'll select this code and then right click, cut, inside try, right click and paste. And I'll create a new line. And now if we make a request and there's some sort of network error, that error will go down here and we'll run the code inside catch. So in here, let's display a message. Console.log the string unexpected error. Try again later. The last step is after we create an order, we should go to the orders page. To do that, at the bottom here, we're going to use an object called window.location. Window.location is a special object provided by JavaScript, and it lets us control the URL at the top of the browser. If we change the location object, it will change the URL at the top. So let's give this a try. We'll go into our code and we'll type window.location. Now location has a property called .href. This gives us the URL at the top of the browser. And if we change the href property, it will change the URL at the top of the browser. So we'll try that in our code. We're going to change .href and make it equal to the string orders.html. So this will replace everything after the slash here with orders.html. And this will open the orders.html file, which is at the bottom here. And this will open the orders page. By the way, orders.html is a file path. The current file is checkout.html because this code is running on the checkout page. So it starts from checkout.html and then looks for a file called orders.html beside it, which is this file here. And it loads this file in the browser. So now let's save. We'll open the project and then click Place Order. So it should create a new order using the backend, and it will take us to the orders page. So right now, we have a list of order objects, and that's all the data that we need to create this page. I'll leave generating the HTML and making this page interactive as exercises. So now let's check our tests to make sure that everything is still working. We'll open the tab for our tests, and I'll refresh just in case, and it looks good, and we'll save our changes into Git. We'll go to the Git section. Inside orders.js, we created some functions for saving our orders, and in paymentsummary.js, we made the place order button interactive, and we use the backend to create an order. Let's create a message describing these changes. Create order using the backend and commit. So we're going to learn one more thing in this lesson, and this is needed to create the tracking page. We're going to learn how to use URL parameters. So first, let's open our project, and we'll go back to the orders page. And on this page, we have these track package links beside the products. If we click this link, it will take us to the tracking page at tracking.html. However, right now this page is just plain HTML. There's no JavaScript. So if we go back to our orders and then track a different product, you'll notice that all of the tracking pages are the same. So we need to make each tracking page different depending on the order and the product. So how do we know which product to track on this page? To create this, we can use a feature called URL parameters. URL parameters let us save data directly in the URL. To create a URL parameter, at the top, after this URL, we're going to type question mark and then order capital ID equals 123, for example, and press enter. So the question mark means we're adding a URL parameter to this URL. So a parameter is a property value pair. The left side is the property and the right side is the value. This is sort of like an object like this. So using URL parameters, we can save some data in the URL like this. And then we can use JavaScript to get this data out of the URL. To do that, we'll go back to our code and we'll open our files here and we'll scroll down to the bottom to the tracking page. And let's scroll all the way down to the bottom. And at the bottom of the body, let's add a script tag to run some JavaScript. So we'll type less than script greater than. And to get the parameters out of the URL, we can use a built-in class called URL. First, let's generate an object using this class. We'll type new capital URL and brackets. And we'll give it the URL that we want to get the parameters from. So in here, we'll type window.location.href. Remember that window.location.href gets the URL at the top of the browser. And now let's save this object in a variable. At the front, we'll create const URL equals this object. So this URL class analyzes the URL that we give it and breaks it down into different parts. One of the parts are the URL parameters. To get the parameters, we're going to use the property URL dot search capital P params. By the way, URL parameters are also called search parameters because they're used for features like YouTube search. So search params will let us get the URL parameters up here. So let's say that we wanted the order ID parameter. Inside our code, search params has a method called .get brackets. And this lets us get individual parameters. So inside here, we'll give it a string and we'll get the order capital ID parameter out of the URL. So let's console.log this. Console.log and brackets. If we save and then open our project and go to the tracking page and then open the console, right click, inspect the console, you'll see that it gave us the order ID that we saved up here. So using that code, we can get URL parameters out of the URL at the top and then use them to create this page. We can also save multiple parameters in the URL. To save another parameter, at the end, we can just type and now we can give it another property value pair, like product capital ID equals 456, and press enter. And now inside our code, we can get this second parameter. So inside here, we're going to make a copy of this line, select it, right click, copy, and then down here, right click, paste. And this time, we're going to get the parameter product capital ID and save. If we open the page and open the console, we got the order ID as well as the product ID out of the URL. So URL parameters lets us save different data in each URL. And we can actually go back and forth between them. So if we click the back button, it will go to this URL, and this URL has different data or parameters saved inside. If we click forward, this URL has different parameters or data saved inside. And this is how YouTube search works. If we search for something, our search is saved as a URL parameter. If we search for something else, our search is also saved as a URL parameter, and we can go back and forth between the two. So this is actually all the data that we need to create the tracking page. We need to know which order it is and which product it is. Now there's one more thing to know to create this page. We'll go back to our code and we're going to open the orders page at orders.html. And we're going to find the track package button using Control F or Command F. And we'll type the text in that button, track package. So notice that these buttons are just a link to the tracking page or tracking.html. So when you're generating this HTML, make sure that you add URL parameters after this tracking page URL using question mark, the order capital ID equals, and then you substitute the order ID like 1, 2, 3, and then also attach the product ID. Product capital ID equals 4, 5, 6. So when generating this HTML, make sure you substitute the order ID and product ID into this URL so that when it opens the tracking page, you know which order and which product to track. I'll leave generating the HTML and making the tracking page interactive as exercises. So now let's save this file and let's check our tests. So we'll open the browser and open the test tab and everything is still working. And we'll save these changes into Git. Open the Git section. In orders.html, we added an example of adding URL parameters to the tracking page link. In tracking.html, we added an example of getting the parameters out of the URL at the top. Let's create a message describing these changes. Add URL parameters example and commit. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned what a backend is and how to make HTTP requests to the backend. We learned how to use XML HTTP request and fetch. We learned how to handle asynchronous code using callbacks, promises, and async await. We learned how to test asynchronous code. We learned about error handling for unexpected errors. We used the backend in our project, and we learned URL parameters. Before we look at the exercises, you might be wondering, what's the next step after this course? Instead of just using a backend, the next step is to learn how to create our own backend. To do that, you'll need to learn the command line. And after that, you'll learn a technology called Node.js, which lets us create our own backend. Also, after this course, you can learn how to put a website on the internet using this video right here. Here are some exercises that'll help you practice what we learned in this lesson. Thanks for watching. Here are some other videos and courses that you might be interested in. If you want to support this channel, you can click like, subscribe, and share this video with others. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.